So I'm going to talk about advanced component patterns, and that's just, the title is just to impress you. Most of these things are not advanced. I'm going to start with very simple things and then build it up for you. Cool, so I'm Siddharth KP on Twitter. You can follow me if you're on Twitter, or you cannot, no pressure, right? I do a bunch of open source stuff. If you use any of these, right, come say hi, I'll be super happy. I also teach React. If that's something you're into, find me later. All right. So the thing I really like about React is that the API is super tiny, right? The size of the icon is intentional. So it's a super tiny API. There's not a lot inside the library, but the community as a whole is pretty big, right? So there's a lot of things that happen outside it. So there's Redux, like we've talked about a lot of things today, right? And plus the community finds more creative ways of using the same APIs to create better techniques or better concepts around it, right? Especially if you guys are active on Twitter, right? It seems like every week somebody figures out a new way of writing stuff, writing the same components but better, right? So if, like, right now I think the most popular thing is RenderProps, right? And we're going to talk about those as well. Cool. So I kind of have this fear of missing out where I'm like, if anything new is coming out, I have to learn all the patterns, right? Because God forbid my code is not the fanciest code that exists, right? So what I did was I kind of addressed that and I learned all the patterns so that you don't have to, and I'm going to talk about 7 component patterns that are kind of hip right now. All right, so just a little context. I work in this place called Auth0, and I work in this team which is at like the middle of designers and developers, which means that I kind of have to talk to both and figure out those things, so that's interesting. You'll see a lot of designy things going on, right? A simple example is this is like a form going on, right? So we look at things like form, and then we look at the rest of the application and try to identify patterns, and then abstract it centrally so that everyone doesn't have to do the same things, right? A less fancy way of saying is I make buttons so that the rest of the company doesn't have to make buttons. They can just use my buttons. Cool. The most fun part, okay, I gave you the punchline. So the most fun part about this is because it's a team that works in center of design and development, my manager is actually a designer, right? So for you who enjoy working with designers, right? Anyone? Right? So yeah, so it's fun, right? And like I don't want to say bad things about him. Right? He's a really nice guy. So you'll hear his name a lot. His nickname is Fur, right? And he is a designer, so you will expect designer things from him. But cool guy. Cool. So it all started like I think around 3 months back, where Fair came to me and said, we need some input boxes, right? All of the UIs have input boxes, so let's create an input box, right? I'm going to start off this talk really slow. So what I did was I slapped a functional component. I said this text input, which takes some props and just gives back some JSX, right? And you render it works, right? So then he came back to me and said, okay, we also need read-only things, right? So I'm like, sure, makes sense. Everyone has those. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, change the API so that text input also takes a read-only prop. And based on the read-only prop, I'm going to change the styles. So I'm going to say, if read-only exists in the props, then also add another class and then use that class underneath, right? So like React 101 stuff. And then yeah, just pass on read-only as a prop to the HTML component as well, HTML element as well for good measure. Right, so this is what is a functional component, right? The first two patterns are silly, so bear with me. The first one is it's functional component. You have a function which gives you JSX. All right, Ferd comes back and says, okay, so there's this team which is doing something interesting, which is it also counts the number of characters that you've written, right? So you enter stuff and the character count goes up, right? Something like Twitter or Slack kind of have those things going on. Cool. So I'm like, cool, yeah, that's something I can do. So I basically added that extra span which has characters, and because I want some state in this, I can't come there because this wire is, it's a thing, never mind. Yeah, so I need a span over there, and because I need some state, I can't use a function. I have to convert into a class component, right? So this is a class component. You wrap things in a render. Props.placeholder becomes this.props, all of that jazz. And then what I can do, I can have a constructor now, right? I can initialize a state. For example, here my state is length is 0. And then I can add an onChange kind of a thing. So like onChange, I grab the element. I see what is the length of the text in it. And then I slap it in state. And I use the same state in the span. So everything works. People type, it works. There's a bind thing going on, right? So this is what a class component is, right? Cool. Now things get interesting. So there's this thing about class components, right? If you want to attach a function to it, you have to do this bind nonsense, right? And no matter how many times I type this, I will always forget this, right? And I understand like the logic behind it. It's like prototypal inheritance and classes are a lie, so there's a this and React, these things, right? But I don't really care, right? I will always forget this. I want to stop writing it. So turns out you actually can do that. You can just skip this part of it, right? What you can also do is, like how you do this is you change your function from like a normal function to an arrow function. And it kind of looks weird because classes are not supposed to have arrow function. This syntax doesn't make sense. But turns out there's a proposal to make it happen, right? So what you can also do is this ugly constructor of ours, which has super. Super is another thing that I always forget. I forget it, React gives me a warning. I'm like, of course, take your stupid super. So what you can do is just get rid of all of that and just say state is this object, right? And this syntax is basically, it's not the class syntax. This is all made up syntax. So this is a proposal. I hope the name is a yes. It's called a class properties transform thingy. I forgot the proposal, but the transform is called class properties transform. So you can just add this in your Babel RC, and then you can get away by not using binds, using arrow functions, forgetting super, just slapping the state over there. The good part for most of us is that create React app already has this in the config, so you can just change your code today and it works, which is nice. Cool. Yeah. So now Fair comes back and he says, I like this label thing you did. Can we have this everywhere, right? Like we have forms. People want to put form labels over there. I'm like, cool. Yeah, that makes sense. But I didn't really have to do much for it because I already had like a span lying around. I can just add a label, right? So I'll skip that. The other interesting thing he said was in emails, people can type whatever they want, caps, small, something. But emails, I think, are supposed to be only small case, right? That's what the format is. So it's like people can make mistakes or be confused. So what we want is when people type capital stuff, we want to convert it into small case, right? So even if you give me, like, even if you have caps lock on and you type stuff, it should look small, right? Like, okay, sure, can be done. So something that our text input earlier was, something to notice is if you have a functional component or if you have an input component that doesn't really rely on state, the value that goes into it, React doesn't really care about it, right? You type it, it gets proxied to the browser's HTML thread, the paint thread, and HTML paint thread is responsible to actually put the value in, right? So React doesn't really care. But in this, and that's called like an uncontrolled component, right? React doesn't control the value in it. If you want to control the value, like in this case, we want not the real value to come in, but all small cased value, we can take control of it. So the way to do this is you say value, and you say this.state.value, right? So I'm saying the value, whatever value goes in is this.state.value. And of course, up there, you declare the initial state for it. And the fun part over here is when you start typing, nothing's going to happen. You can start typing, it's going to go away, right? Because now when you're typing, that's not the real value. The value is what is in the state, which is empty, right? So you took control of the component. Now the keyboard and HTML things are like not connected anymore because React is in the between, right? So controlled component. To make this work the way you want, you need to basically handle the change event. So you pass an onChange where you can do whatever you want. So in this case, what I'm doing is whatever value you type, I'm going to convert it to lowercase and set that into state. And because I'm using this.state.value in my input, it's going to use that, right? So it's basically now keyboard to React to HTML, right? We've basically controlled our component. Right? So you can type uppercase, small case, whatever you want. I'm going to convert it to lowercase. Cool. So yeah, the label thing really caught on, right? And he's like, cool, we have labels, and then in forms we have these text areas and stuff, right? We also want to be able to do that. And so like the text area is kind of simple. You just have a text area, you have some placeholder with it, but the label part of it is interesting, right? So what we want to do is consistently have the same design for the label. So let me go back too much. Yeah, so you notice that how all of these things are aligned and how the label is always on the left, right? So this is like a design pattern which we don't really want everyone to worry about, like figure out the width, how much padding, all of that. We just want to do it for everyone, right? Doesn't matter what is on the right side of the label. So one way to do this is with this nice thing called with label as a function, right? So you have a function which you pass in the label, the text label and the component, and it will return another component which has this styles inbuilt, right? What this thing would look like is basically it's a function that returns a functional component which just has JSX, and the label is basically copied from there, and class name, all of that is hidden from the people, right? Like you don't really have to worry about how these designy things happen. You just worry about what is the label name, and all of that is abstracted away. So this is called higher order component, right? A higher order component is you give me a component as a variable, what I'll return is also a component, right? This used to be all the hype last year, and now people don't love it anymore, right? It's like one of those things where you adopt a puppy, and now everyone likes the puppy, right? So higher order components were everywhere. They would use it everywhere. Redux had a higher order component wrapper. React Router had it. Like everyone did it, right? And I think they overdid it, right? So you show this puppy to everyone. Everyone is giving it cookies, right? Everyone's feeding it. And now the puppy is not a puppy anymore. It's like a fat dog, right? And fat dogs are not fun. Nobody likes fat dogs. People like puppies. So then people forgot about this and replaced it with this new puppy called RenderProps, which we'll come back to. But still, like higher order components still pretty useful. Another syntax for higher order components is you can actually just use another component, which, for example, in this case, I use the JSX format where I say with label, and I pass the label as a prop instead of a function variable. And this works pretty much the same way, just the only difference is that now this with label is not a function, it's also a component. And then you can wrap it, and then inside it, I don't really care what you give me. I'm just going to say, just render the children that come inside this, right? So this is a slightly more liberal way of doing it. You don't really care how many variables are there in the function. You just say whatever is inside it is going to get wrapped. In some cases, this is more useful. Cool. Yeah, so now like Fer got really excited with this. He's like, other people don't have to worry about the design, and only we can, and then other people get the design for free, right? This is like a designer's dream, right? Because most of us don't care about design, right? And we shouldn't have to. It just makes sense. But the designers really want polished stuff, right? So he got really excited by this, where things are abstracted. He gets to control the design. People don't get to change it, which was like one of the fanciest things, that people don't get to screw around his design, and everyone gets it. So he said, we're going to do this for everything, right? And then we create switch components and etc. And then in the form, we have actions underneath it, right? Yeah, like save, clear, all of those things. So we wanted to formalize this pattern where there's a divider first, and then there's a save, change, clear button. The primary button is dark. The normal button is like fancy hipster gray. And then the alignment of these buttons is with the input, right? It's not on the left, it's not on the right. It's somewhere aligned with the input, right? Looks pretty, but it's like you need to know what is the left margin to be able to do this, right? And I think we've all done this in our lives, where we go to the designer and say, how many pixels is this, right? And then like he'll take out his like Photoshop and like put a ruler on it and say, this is 32 pixels, right? So all of that, you shouldn't have to do all of that, which is like the premise, right? So then how can you abstract all of these design decisions and just create forms? So the first thing is, let's just create a form. Right. Inside that form, because I want the label, I can say with label and slap the text input, right? I can also add other things like address, which is the text area. I can add a switch, which is the accept, reject thing, right? And inside that, I can do this thing called div class actions, and inside it are buttons, right? So this is one way that I can have class name action. And then if you use the actions class name and you only put buttons inside it, right, then it's going to get aligned over here, right? But the moment you put something else, like if you put another row in it, right, it's going to go bonkers because it only has enough space to fit buttons, right? If there's like if you put another input field, it's going to go somewhere else, maybe on the next line, right? So it's still not the amount of control that we want to have over the UI, right? So this is where you can do other patterns, which is this thing, right? This is a syntax I really like. So you have a form component, and inside the form component, you have other child components or related components. So you say form dot text input, and then you say label placeholder, right? So see how you don't even have to say with label. You just say if form has a text input, it also must have a label. They say form.text area, that also has a label. And this thing form.actions is which renders the buttons, right? So the fun part is you don't really know which button, is it a gray button, black button? You don't care. You say this is my primary action, this is my secondary action, this is what it is called, this is the method that you're supposed to call onClick, right? So I really like this because it kind of abstracts away all the design part of it, right? So it's how we always talk about separating your, what do we call it now? Dumb components and smart components, right? So, and the key over there is always like people want to keep the dumb stuff away so that they can focus on the smart stuff, right? This is the dumb stuff, right? We want, let us do all of the dumb stuff for you so that you don't have to, right? So form actions is kind of the thing that does that. You only give me data. So this thing is called compound components, right? This is my favorite pattern. I learned it last year by this guy right here who calls it compo, right? Silakshi gave a talk at JS Fool last year about this. Excellent pattern. You should use it everywhere you can. The other interesting part which he talked about last year, which I doesn't fit my use case, which is in this case, if the design changes, right, and you want to put actions on the top, right, or you want to basically change the layout of how the form is, but not change the underlying design of it or the data you pass to it. You should be able to play, like, one day I can just say actions are on the top now, right? And it's going to render the exact same way without messing up the data part of it, right? So that's a nice part of compound components where you can individually arrange them the way you want without changing the data that you pass to it or the underlying decision, right? Good for compound components, horrible for me because I don't want anyone to touch my forms, right? I want them exactly laid out like this, right? So, but just for your like information, that's also something you can do with it. Yeah, so let's see how does this look like. So the form is just a React component which renders a form and blindly slaps props.children inside it. One thing that I did not show right here is you can also do a lot of validation. For example, in the form component that I have form.prop types, and the rule I have inside it is that the component should be an instance of one of these guys, like form text input, form.action. Like you can't use something that is not form.x, right? So that it's again one of those control freaky things that designers and me like to do, right? Text input is interesting. It's just the funny part is you can just say form.text input is equal to a normal component, right? So in this case, I'm reusing the code which says with label so that you don't have to worry about it, but it uses the same thing. It uses props.label, right? So the interesting thing is that you can actually just create individual components. It's how we already had a text input, we already had a with label, but then we club them together and mask them behind form.text input, right? And how all of this works because like components are at the end JavaScript objects, and JavaScript objects allow you to set more keys on them, right? So you can actually set whatever key you want and then document it and use it. Same thing goes for text area. It's just a with label text area. Right? And then you slap them all together, and then you get this nice UI. Cool. Yeah, so this one gets really interesting. So this is something that we wanted to do, right? Right now, all of our forms have the left label, and left labels kind of suck because once you go responsive, where will they go? So they kind of flow in, right? It's also not the best alignment thing because most of those are like different widths. So you can left align them, and there's like this ugly space between email and the text, which is not there in address, or you right align them, and then it looks crooked on the left. So top labels are cool. The most interesting part about this is that, because you're writing this, right? You don't even care where the label is. Top, left, no label, don't care, right? So what we've been able to do is, this is what we gave people, right? And they used it on their production. And then we changed the design underlying design everywhere. We put labels on the top, and all they had to do is go to their package.json and say, now the version is not this, version is +1, right? They just like upgrade the dependency and the design changes underneath, right? So this is kind of like a mixed thing for you, for people who don't want to play around with CSS or have a lot of time wasted because designer, developer keep talking about this. This has been great because designer gets to change the design without talking to all the developers, all the products, and for everyone else it's just a dependency upgrade, right? So that's been cool. It also has its people problems of it, because when we did this, some people got offended that how did you not tell us before changing the design, right? So like, other than the people handling the people problem where you warn them that something is coming, please be happy, it's been pretty powerful for us. All right, moving on. So one team over here was doing something interesting where they did not have the label on the left, they had it on the right, right? And it's just something that there is. So it's like fine. I said, okay, fine, like we moved on. But the more interesting part about this was they used it for a project name. And then project names had a limit on the number of characters you can put in, right? So it starts with you start typing, and after a while, after you exceed the limit, we're supposed to show like a warning thing, like make it red that you can't have 34 characters, only like some limit is allowed. After that, the characters become red. Like it's like a validation error. So I'm like, cool, yeah, we can do this, right? So we already have this label thing going on. I'm just gonna move this span to the end, that's okay. And in the on change, I'm gonna say if the length is greater than 30, then set the error state, right? And based on if there's an error or not, I'm going to add another class name, right? Seems simple enough. I already have on change and all of that. Like it's already a control component, so I know what's going on. Only thing I need is to add an error. You can make it more flexible. Don't use 30. Use say this.props.limit, so people can pass the limit. This is how people started using it, right? You had a text input, and if you give me text input limit something, then instead of staying black, it becomes red after a while, right? So they came back and they said, we really liked it. We're using it everywhere. Now we want to also give warnings to people, right? So when you start typing this, we want to show like an orange or a yellow state that you're reaching 30, right? A lot of people do this in validations where when you're approaching the error state, they give you like a warning state, and then after that they give you, it's good UX, right? You should know that something is gonna happen before it actually happens, right? And I'm like, yeah, I mean, I can do this, right? But what would I do? I'll say error limit is 30 and warning limit is 25, right? Like that's just ugly, right? And then in my code, I'll have multiple checks, right? So it seemed like very custom to this team, but also generic enough to use the same components that we already have. So what we decided over there was, I said, I don't care about this label. Use my text input, but I'm gonna not take responsibility for your label. You render the label, right? So, and how do we let them render the label is by accepting this prop, which is a render label prop, and you give me a function inside this, right? So not a component, not a string, you give me a function. And I'm gonna call that function. As long as that function returns JSX, we're good, right? So this is what it looked like. I give you the length, and then you decide you wanna put a span there, put a div there, put a like a scared emoji there, I don't care, do your color, class name, whatever, but give me JSX, that's the only contract. Right? This is called the RenderProp, which is like all the hype, and it's interesting because it lets you give control back to the user, right, in the places that it doesn't make sense to be in the system. Cool, so yeah, they did something like this where they had a class name and then they control that class name, and length is 25, all of that stupidness. Right? What I had to do is, I just had the same code, but instead of the span where I was showing this and doing all of the manipulations, I call this.props.renderLabel, right? So I call that function, it returns JSX, which goes into my component, and it renders over there, right? And because it's still in my controlled environment where there's like a div and there's an input and it's after that, I still control the position of it, the font size of it, all of the things I want to, right? But I can give weird, fancy things that they want to do to them, right? So it's interesting where you can choose to give some control back, right? And this has become, like, this is the new puppy right now. So React Router does this, and it makes a lot of sense for them because in the React Router, you control the page, right? You control your content. They only control the routing part of it, right? So in this example, I return the length as a variable, right? They return some router passed props, like which is the URL, what are the params passed, and then you control what you want to do with it. It makes a lot of sense. Cool. Yeah, so this is, animations are the worst, yeah. So this is something that is taking it to the extreme, right? You can just have one variable called render, right? And then just call that and give the state inside it, right? You can choose to give the entire state of the application, of the component back to this, and people care about the, the rendering part. So it's again going back to the smart and dumb components, right? It's how till now we were only caring about the dumb part, the presentation part, but in this case we care about the exact opposite, right? So the length logic is over here, but what you want to render is back to you, right? So this is a only smart component, and it calls RenderProp to render the presentation part of it. Cool. So this is the best part that happened. So and this is kind of new. So last week he came to me, and so I'm still new in the company, so I don't know a lot what's happening. So he came to me last week and said, we're launching a new product. So I'm like, awesome, that's pretty cool. I didn't know we had another product, right? And he said, yeah, we have this product and it's super nice, but they have like a slightly different color scheme, right? So it's like how we have these black and grays. They actually don't have that. They have these blue things, right? So the switch is actually blue. And the primary buttons are not black, they're blue. Right? So in theory, it's like not that big a deal, because I just need to change some color variables, right? It's like theming at the heart of it. But the fact that we have so many components and there are so many components that have these colors, it can be tricky. So one way I thought of doing this was, I'll let people give me a theme, right? So just for context, the black button product is called manage, and the blue button product is called extend, right? So I can ask people to give me the theme, right? So in form.switch, which cares about the color and button, you pass me a theme, I'll render that. If you change the theme to extend, I'll just render the blue stuff, right? And for me, this is like not really that big a deal, because inside my button component, I can say, based on the prop.theme, pick this color or that color, right? But for people, this is like kind of a big deal for people to know where to pass this prop, right? It's how the input box doesn't care about the theme prop, but the buttons do, right? So how do you get that across to multiple people in multiple products, right? It doesn't make sense. So what we want to do is pull this theme to just one place, right? You should be able to declare once in your app that my app follows this theme of products, and everything else should just change on its own. So yeah, so this is like rendering the app. And I want to be able to wrap that in like a theme provider, where you give me this information once, that name is, like the theme name is manage, and the rest of the app components should just figure themselves out. Do I want to be blue? Do I want to be black? All of that, right? You change it in one place, it should reflect everywhere. So this is known as a provider component, right? And the fun part is you've all used this before in some form of the other, right? Like React Router or Redux, all of them, it's how Redux has a Redux provider that you slap on the top, and then you can grab state wherever you want to. Cool. The fun part is it uses the context API, right? React context. And before you guys mob out on me and says, no, they told me not to use React context, right? It's bad, it's gonna deprecate, it's gonna break. We're gonna look at it, calm down. So the interesting thing is in the context docs, they first tell you what context is. I'm just gonna read it super fast. In some cases, you want to pass data through the component tree without having to pass down the props manually at every level, right? This is kind of what we want. Declare it once, but we want access to it across all of our presentation components. Then they have the next section, which is why not to use context, right? And they have a bunch of reasons. We're gonna quickly go through all of them to just so that you guys don't burn me after this, basically. First one, the vast majority of applications do not need to use context, which is exactly kind of what we're going for. Our component library uses context. The rest of the products don't have to. So I'm gonna take, this makes sense. If you're not familiar with state management libraries or don't use context, for many practical React bindings are a good choice. So the interesting thing that they're saying is context is not the best solution always. State management libraries like Redux or MobX kind of make it easier for you to do, right? The bad part about us is because we're at the center and we control most of the presentation, we can't force people with a state management library, right? Some people might want to use Redux, some people might want to use MobX. Some people might not want to use any state management. We don't get to take that call, right? Because we're the dumb part of the application, right? So, cool, understood. If you aren't an experienced React developer, don't use context. The talk is called Advanced React Components. I'm going to use this. I'm going to slap, like, sure, we're advanced here. If you want to, now they get like, if you've read through this, now they get like hardcore. If you want your application to be stable, don't use context, right? Now this is something you can't get past, right? All of us want stable things. Like, it's an experimental API, and it's likely to break in the future releases, right? The interesting part that they said was that the API is experimental, right? The feature is not. So the API is definitely going to change, but context as a feature is going to stick around, right? So it's like just something to be aware of, right? So I'm not going to put a tick on it. I'm going to say, all right, I appreciate this point. And if you guys have been following what's going on right now, they're actually changing the context API right now. And I think they released it like yesterday or day before, where React 16.3 will have the new context API also. And the feature exists, the API has changed completely, right? This is where the next point comes in, which is if you still insist on using context despite all of these warnings, try to isolate your use to just one part of the app, so that when the API breaks, which is now, you should be able to upgrade to the new API fast enough, which makes sense. I appreciate that. Thanks for the heads up. Cool. By the way, Redux, Mobek, style components, all of these use context. If you're using any of these, your application is not stable and it's experimental and right? So we're all screwed. But the good part is you are not using it directly. You're using it in Redux. Redux is going to upgrade to the new API. It will all work out, right? So the last point kind of makes sense. We're all saved. Cool. So how you use that is in the theme provider, this component that is supposed to carry it. It's just a React component, and it renders whatever is inside it. It doesn't really care about the children part of it. We can define the context by using this thing called getChildContext, and this is where you define it. So you say theme this.props.name, right? So the name prop is going to go into the theme variable, right? So this is how you set the context, right? And they're kind of strict about context being like super rigid. So you also have to like give it a type. Right? This is I think the only thing in React which forces you to have a type system thing, right? So you can use prop types and say theme is always going to be a string. If somebody gives me a number, it's going to throw a warning. Cool. And then inside all of the other components that I have, I can actually just skip and say go to the button component. Right? Inside the button component, I have this class name thing going on, right? I say class name is button. I can get this context variable by declaring button.context type and say give me the theme variable, and it's of the same data type, prop type.string, right? So now once you define at the top level, it's available to all of the components that explicitly say, I want access to this, right? There are places which this breaks, and that's why they're coming up with a new thing. You can declare new context at different points in your application, and then for example, button will only get theme prop from its nearest parent that has a theme context, right? So if inside this app, somebody also created another context which also has theme of type string, they're going to get that one, not the one I intend, right? So that's why it has its limitation, which are going away with the new API. But that's why they kind of don't promote it too much. In our case, it didn't matter. We can also, a lot of people do these smart things where they don't say theme. They say underscore underscore theme underscore underscore, right? Or capital theme underscore. This is actually from the React code base, which says in all caps lock, it says context variable do not change or you'll get fired, right? This is like the variable name, right? And it's like conflict free because nobody will type this exact thing. And because I control theme provider and button, I can get away by choosing a key which is so unique that it doesn't clash, right? It's been working out in the React code base. So I think we're all safe, right? And then once you declare the context, you get it just next to props as an extra variable, as an extra functional variable. And you can use that in the theme. So for example, I just change the class name and say context.theme, add it to like it's button hyphen extend, right? The theme of it. And I use the class name. And I do this in all the components that care about theme, and it kind of works because class name is consistent. So you can just go to theme provider, change it to manage, and all of the context gets passed. It all works, right? So one thing that we did not talk about was the last one, which is they told me that if you want to still use it despite all of the warnings, at least make sure it's in one file so that you can change it later. So let's take care of that. I didn't do that. I'm actually going to every component and saying this is the context. Instead of this, let me wrap it into a function which says AddContext. And then AddContext, I'll define it in only one file, the same file my theme provider lives in. And it's not a very smart function. All it does is takes the component and sets this key value, which is theme, as prop type.string, right? So I'm setting the context in one place. So I've kind of created a wrapper around the current context API, which is AddContext function. And when the API changes now, I'm going to just change this one function to whatever the new API is, and my app shouldn't break too much, right? This is what we're doing with things like Redux anyway. Cool, so I can like proudly put a tick there. Right, so these were the 7 component patterns. I hope you learned something, right? I'm Siddharth KP on Twitter. Follow me for random garbage stuff. Thanks.